The deep space exploration vessel, USS Horizon, had been traveling through uncharted space for 3 months when everything went wrong. Captain Jack was reviewing navigation reports in his ready room when the ship shook violently, and alarms began screaming throughout every corridor. He rushed to the bridge and found his crew struggling to understand what had happened. Lieutenant Commander Lisa Tanner looked up from her science station with wide eyes. She told the captain that the experimental jump drive had malfunctioned during a routine diagnostic. Instead of remaining stationary, the ship had jumped to coordinates that did not exist in any human star chart. They were somewhere completely unknown. Chief Engineer Brooks called from the engine room with worse news. The jump drive was heavily damaged and would need weeks of repair before they could attempt another jump. They were stranded in this unknown region of space with no way to get home quickly. Captain took a deep breath and ordered his crew to remain calm. They had trained for unexpected situations. They had supplies for 6 months. They would figure this out together. He asked Lisa to scan their surroundings and determine where exactly they had ended up. What Lisa found made everyone on the bridge fall silent. Her sensors were detecting thousands of energy signatures all around them. Ships of designs they had never seen before filled the space near an enormous station complex orbiting a massive gas giant. The structures were so large that Earth's biggest cities could fit inside them several times over. This was not an empty region of space. They had jumped directly into the middle of an alien civilization. Navigation Officer Cole checked his instruments again and again, hopping for an error. There was no error. They were surrounded by alien vessels, and several of those vessels were now changing course to approach the USS Horizon. Security Chief Grant ordered her teams to battle stations, but Captain raised his hand. They were one ship against thousands. Fighting would be suicide. Their only option was to communicate and hope these aliens were willing to talk. Communications Officer Greg worked frantically at his station, trying to find a frequency the aliens might respond to. After several tense minutes, a signal came through. It was a transmission on a universal mathematical frequency, the kind any spacefaring species would recognize. The aliens wanted to talk. The translation took time. Greg worked with Lisa to decode the alien language using pattern recognition software. When they finally understood the message, the crew learned that they had entered the sovereign territory of something called the Dominion. This was apparently a galactic empire that controlled over 3,000 star systems. The USS Horizon was ordered to hold position and prepare for inspection. Captain asked Greg to send a response explaining that they were peaceful explorers who had arrived by accident. Their jump drive had malfunctioned, and they meant no offense or intrusion. They simply wanted to repair their ship and return home. The response came quickly. They did not care about human intentions. All newcomers to Dominion space were subject to assessment and classification. This was not a request. This was how things worked in this part of the galaxy. The humans would comply or face consequences. Dr. Maria Santos, the ship's chief medical officer, stood beside the captain and whispered that they had no choice. Fighting was impossible. Running was impossible. They had to play along until they understood more about these aliens and their empire. Agreed. He ordered Greg to send confirmation that the USS Horizon would comply with inspection protocols. Within an hour, a massive alien vessel approached and extended a docking tube to connect with their ship. The crew gathered near the main airlock, unsure what to expect. When the doors opened, they got their first look at the aliens were tall, standing over 7 feet, with bodies covered in hard shells that shimmered with rainbow colors. They had large compound eyes that seemed to look in every direction at once. Their limbs were thin but numerous, and they moved with precise mechanical efficiency. The leader of the alien delegation introduced himself through a translation device as overseer. He explained that he was responsible for cataloging new species that entered Dominion space. His tone was flat and bored, like someone who had performed this task thousands of times before and found it tedious. Looked around the ship's corridor with obvious disappointment. He made clicking sounds that the translator interpreted as dismissive laughter. He told his companions that the human vessel was primitive even by lower-tier standards. The metal was crude. The technology was ancient. These creatures had barely discovered space travel. Captain felt anger rising in his chest, but he kept his face neutral. He had dealt with arrogant people before. He had dealt with bureaucrats who thought they were better than everyone else. The fact that this one was an alien did not change how he would handle him. He would be polite, patient, and observant. He would learn everything he could about these and their empire. The inspection began immediately. Technicians spread throughout the ship, examining every system and taking readings with devices the humans could not understand. They opened panels without asking permission. They handled equipment carelessly. They spoke about the humans as though they were not present, making observations about their primitive nature and limited intelligence. Lisa watched them examine her science station and barely contained her frustration. One technician looked at her quantum sensor array and made a dismissive gesture, saying it was the kind of technology species developed in their early spacefaring years. He seemed almost amused that humans were proud of such basic equipment. Stood in his engine room while engineers poked at his damaged jump drive. They laughed at its design, calling it dangerous and inefficient. One of them said it was a miracle humans had not killed themselves with such crude technology. Through it all, the crew of the USS Horizon remained professional. They answered questions honestly. They did not rise to the insults. They watched and listened and remembered everything. By the end of the first day, Overseer had formed his initial assessment. Humanity was clearly a young and underdeveloped species. They would likely be classified somewhere in the lower tiers of the Dominion hierarchy. This meant they would be given limited rights and assigned roles appropriate to their capabilities, probably manual labor or simple service positions. Captain thanked the Overseer for his time and asked when they could expect the final classification. Said it would take several days. More tests were required. The humans would remain docked at the station until the process was complete. After the return to their ship for the night, gathered his senior staff in the conference room. He looked at each of them carefully before speaking. He told them he had seen the way the aliens treated them, and he understood their frustration. But he asked them to be patient a little longer. They needed information. They needed to understand how this empire worked before they decided what to do next. Asked what options they really had. They were one damaged ship in the middle of an empire with thousands of warships. Smiled slightly. He reminded her that humans had faced impossible odds before. They had always found a way. They would find one here too. For now, they would cooperate. They would learn. And when the time was right, they would show these arrogant aliens exactly what humanity was capable of. The assessment process began the next morning when Overseer returned with a larger team of specialists. They had brought equipment to conduct what they called standard evaluation protocols. Every new species encountered by the Dominion went through this process. It determined where they would fit in the galactic hierarchy that they had maintained for over 10,000 years. Captain watched as the aliens set up testing stations throughout the ship. He had ordered his crew to cooperate fully and to treat this as an opportunity to learn. Whatever tests they wanted to conduct, the humans would participate without complaint. Wanted to understand exactly how this empire thought, what they valued, and what they considered important. Dr. Maria Santos was the first to undergo examination. The medical specialists treated her like a specimen rather than a person. They took blood samples, tissue samples, and scans of her entire body without explaining what they were looking for. They measured her reflexes, tested her sensory responses, and examined her internal organs using imaging technology far beyond anything humans had developed. Throughout the process, the technicians spoke to each other as though Maria was not there. They noted that human bone density was surprisingly high, likely due to evolution on a heavy gravity world. They observed that human immune systems were remarkably aggressive, attacking foreign substances with unusual intensity. They documented that human sensory range was limited compared to many species, but their brains showed interesting complexity in areas related to pattern recognition and creative thinking. Maria listened to everything and kept her expression calm. When they finished, she asked if she could see the results. The lead medical technician looked at her with what seemed like surprise that she had spoken at all. He told her that assessment data was not shared with subject species. She would learn her classification when the process was complete. Similar examinations were conducted on volunteers from the crew. They seemed particularly interested in human physical endurance. They ran tests that pushed crew members to their limits, making them run, lift, and perform tasks until exhaustion. Security Chief Grant completed a physical stress test that left observers making rapid clicking sounds among themselves. Her performance apparently exceeded their predictions for a species of human classification. The intellectual assessments were equally condescending. Scholars presented puzzles and problems to the crew, starting with what they considered basic tests suitable for primitive minds. Lieutenant Commander Lisa Tanner solved their entry-level mathematics challenges in minutes and asked for something more difficult. The scholars exchanged glances and provided intermediate problems. Lisa solved those as well. Dr. Benjamin Price, the ship's theoretical physicist, was brought before a panel of scientists who specialized in fundamental physics. They began by testing his understanding of basic concepts they considered universal knowledge among spacefaring species. Ben answered correctly, and then asked questions of his own about physics theories. The aliens were not prepared for a primitive species to engage them in actual scientific discussion. During one session, Ben pointed out an inconsistency in the standard Dominion model of subspace dynamics. The physicist he was speaking with dismissed his observation as the confusion of an underdeveloped mind. Ben did not argue. He simply wrote out the mathematical proof showing the error and handed it to the alien. The physicist studied the equations for a long time before leaving the room without another word. Chief Engineer Brooks faced a practical technology assessment. They gave him broken equipment and basic tools, then asked him to make repairs. They expected him to struggle with their advanced technology. Instead, examined each device carefully, figured out how it worked despite never having seen anything like it before, and repaired them all. Then he suggested improvements that would make the devices more efficient. The engineer overseeing the test refused to believe that the modifications would work, offered to demonstrate. The engineer reluctantly agreed. When the improved device performed 40% better than its original specifications, they simply confiscated it and ended the session early. Communications Officer Greg was tested on his ability to decode and understand alien languages. They presented him with recordings in dozens of different tongues, expecting him to identify basic patterns at most. Greg had spent his entire career studying communication theory and linguistic structures. Within hours, he had not only identified patterns, but had begun constructing basic translation matrices for languages that had taken decades to decode when they first encountered them. The conducting the language assessment seemed genuinely disturbed by the results. He kept running the tests again, certain there must be some mistake. Primitive species were not supposed to demonstrate this level of linguistic capability. When Greg asked if there was a problem, the alien simply ended the assessment and left. Throughout the evaluation process, the crew of the USS Horizon maintained their composure and professionalism. They did not brag about their successes or complain about the disrespectful treatment. They simply performed to the best of their abilities and let the results speak for themselves. On the third day of assessment, Overseer requested a private meeting with Captain. The bureaucrat seemed less confident than he had been during their first encounter. He explained that the evaluation was producing unexpected results that required consultation with higher authorities. The humans were not fitting into the standard classification categories as easily as anticipated. Asked what that meant for his crew, said that preliminary classification had placed humanity at Tier 9, a level reserved for species considered moderately intelligent and physically capable, but technologically primitive. However, some of the assessment data suggested that this classification might not be entirely accurate. Further review was needed. Nodded politely and asked how long the review would take. Said it could be several more days or possibly weeks. The High Conclave might need to be consulted if the anomalies in the data could not be resolved through standard procedures. After left, gathered his senior staff again. He shared what he had learned and asked for their observations from the assessment process. One by one, his officers reported that they seemed increasingly uncomfortable with the results they were recording. The aliens had expected humans to fail at most tests and struggle with the rest. Instead, the crew was performing at levels that clearly confused and concerned them. Lisa suggested that the Dominion's classification system was designed to confirm assumptions rather than discover truth. They expected new species to be inferior because their entire society was built on the belief that they and their founding partners were naturally superior to everyone else. Humans were not behaving according to their expectations, and they did not know how to handle it. Pointed out that confused enemies made mistakes. If they were uncertain about how to classify humanity, that uncertainty could be used to human advantage. Agreed but counseled patience. They were still gathering information. They still had a damaged ship and no way to get home quickly. Rushing into action before they fully understood the situation would be foolish. But he was beginning to form a plan, a way to turn arrogance against them and secure a better position for humanity in this strange new galaxy they had stumbled into. The question was whether the Dominion would give them the opportunity they needed. Suspected they would. Empires that had been unchallenged for 10,000 years tended to underestimate new threats. They had already made one critical mistake by treating humans as primitive creatures barely worth their attention. Intended to make sure they had the chance to make many more mistakes before this was over. The opportunity captain had been waiting for came on the 5th day of their detention at the station. Overseer returned with news that the High Conclave had reviewed the preliminary assessment data. They had decided to maintain the Tier 9 classification for humanity despite the anomalies in the test results. Humans would be registered as a labor species with limited rights within Dominion territory. Listened to the verdict calmly and then asked a question that would change everything. He asked if there was any way to challenge this classification. He had heard rumors from station workers that challenge protocols existed for species who believed they had been incorrectly categorized. His compound eyes flickered with what might have been amusement. He confirmed that challenge protocols did exist. Any species could request official trials to demonstrate capabilities beyond their assigned tier. However, he warned that in 10,000 years of Dominion history, no newly encountered species had ever successfully challenged their initial classification. The trials were designed by the finest minds in the Empire and calibrated to confirm the natural order of species hierarchy. Said he understood the odds. He formally requested challenge trials for humanity on behalf of the crew of the USS Horizon and the planet Earth they represented. Seemed delighted by this request. He explained that the trials would be broadcast across the Dominion's communication networks for all citizens to observe. Most species found such broadcasts entertaining, watching primitive newcomers fail spectacularly at tests designed for superior beings. He assured that humanity's failure would be witnessed by trillions of viewers across 3,000 star systems. Thanked him for the information and asked when the trials would begin. Said preparations would take 2 days. The humans should use that time to rest and accept the futility of their situation. After the overseer left, called his entire crew together in the cargo bay. He explained what he had done and what it meant. They would face 5 trials testing physical capability, intellectual prowess, technological innovation, strategic thinking, and artistic expression. The entire galaxy would be watching. If they failed, humanity would be condemned to exist as a servant species for as long as the Dominion endured. He asked if anyone objected to his decision. No one did. Instead, his crew began volunteering for the different trials based on their skills and expertise. They had 2 days to prepare, and they intended to use every minute. The first trial was physical. Security Chief Grant selected 12 of her best Marines to compete in what they called the Gauntlet. This was an obstacle course through shifting gravity fields, extreme temperature zones, and simulated combat scenarios. Species were expected to complete it within a time limit appropriate to their tier. For Tier 9 species, the limit was generous because the assumed primitive beings would struggle with even basic challenges. And her team entered the gauntlet while billions of aliens watched through broadcast screens across the Empire. The course began with a zero-gravity maze filled with obstacles that required precise movement and spatial awareness. The Marines had trained extensively in zero-gravity environments during their space careers. They cleared the maze in a fraction of the expected time. The temperature zones came next, ranging from extreme cold to searing heat. Human bodies had evolved on a planet with dramatic climate variation. They were built to adapt to temperature extremes that would incapacitate many species. Led her team through burning corridors and freezing chambers without slowing down. The combat scenarios at the end of the course featured holographic enemies that attacked with increasing sophistication. The Marines worked together with practiced efficiency, covering each other and eliminating threats with precise coordination. They completed the entire gauntlet in less than half the time allotted for Tier 9 species. Their performance met the standards expected of Tier 3 species, just 2 levels below themselves. The second trial tested intellectual capacity. Dr. Benjamin Price represented humanity before a panel of scholars who had devoted centuries to their fields. They presented mathematical puzzles of increasing complexity, expecting the human to falter quickly. Ben solved their puzzles one after another, explaining his reasoning as he worked. When he finished their prepared problems, he asked if they had anything more challenging. The scholars were forced to improvise, pulling from their own research to create problems they believed no outsider could solve. Ben solved those too. Then he pointed out fundamental errors in 3 of the standard mathematical proofs that formed the foundation of Dominion scientific education. The scholars initially dismissed his claims as primitive confusion. When Ben provided rigorous proofs showing exactly where their errors lay, they fell silent. The broadcast audience watched as the finest minds in the Empire struggled to refute a human who had been classified as barely intelligent. The third trial examined technological innovation. Chief Engineer Brooks was placed in a workshop filled with broken devices and given basic tools. He was expected to repair what he could while demonstrating the limits of human technical understanding. Approached each device methodically, examining its components and deducing its function through careful observation. Within hours, he had repaired every item he was given, but did not stop there. He began modifying the repaired devices, improving their designs based on principles the engineers had overlooked. When he finished, the devices performed far beyond their original specifications. The judges tried to dismiss his improvements as flukes or tricks, offered to explain exactly what he had done and why it worked. His explanations were clear, logical, and impossible to refute. The fourth trial was strategic thinking. Lieutenant Commander Amy faced the Dominion's finest tactical minds in a series of war simulations. They had been waging and winning wars for 10,000 years. Their strategies were refined through countless conflicts against hundreds of species. Amy studied their patterns for exactly 1 hour before their first match. She identified the assumptions underlying their tactics, the habits they had developed over of easy victories against inferior opponents. Then she systematically destroyed their fleets in 12 consecutive simulations, using unexpected approaches that exploited weaknesses that had never bothered to address because no one had ever challenged them effectively. The fifth trial was artistic expression. Ensign Peter had studied music before joining the space program. He carried an acoustic guitar that had belonged to his grandfather, a simple wooden instrument that they dismissed as a primitive noise maker. Peter sat before an auditorium filled with representatives from dozens of species. He began to play, moving through melodies that expressed joy, sorrow, longing, triumph, and loss. His music told stories without words, conveying emotions that transcended language and biology. When he finished, the auditorium was completely silent. Species from across the tier system were weeping through whatever biological mechanisms they possessed for emotional release. Even the sat motionless, their compound eyes fixed on the human with his simple wooden instrument. No one laughed at humanity after that performance. No one made dismissive clicking sounds about primitive species. The trials were complete, and the results were undeniable. Humanity had not merely passed. Humanity had dominated every single challenge the Dominion could devise. The results of the challenge trials created a crisis within the Dominion that had no precedent in its 10,000-year history. By every measurement, by every standard the Empire had established since its founding, humanity should have been classified as a Tier 1 species. This was a category that had been reserved exclusively for the and the two other founding species, who had built the Dominion together at the dawn of their interstellar expansion. High Overseer Methcallan convened an emergency session of the High Conclave within hours of the trial's ending. The ruling council of the Dominion gathered in their ancient chamber to discuss what they called the human anomaly. They had watched the broadcasts like everyone else in the Empire. They had seen a species they had dismissed as primitive outperform their finest competitors in every category. The debate among the council members was heated and confused. Some argued that the trial results must have been manipulated somehow. Perhaps the humans had cheated using technology they had hidden from the initial assessment. Perhaps the judges had been corrupted. The alternative was too disturbing to accept. Others suggested more direct solutions. The humans had exactly one ship with fewer than 200 individuals. It would be simple to quarantine them, destroy their vessel, and erase all evidence that they had ever existed. The broadcasts could be explained as a technical malfunction. Within a generation, the human anomaly would be forgotten. A few voices urged caution. The trials had been broadcast across the entire empire. Billions of citizens from thousands of worlds had watched humans triumph over the challenges. Erasing that memory would be difficult if not impossible. More importantly, trying to destroy the humans might confirm that the Dominion feared them. That fear could be more dangerous than the humans themselves. While the High Conclave debated, Captain and his crew were preparing for exactly this situation. Lieutenant Commander Lisa Tanner had spent every available moment since their arrival mapping the Dominion's communication networks. She had identified the key relay stations, the broadcast frequencies, and the security protocols that governed information flow across the Empire. Communications Officer Greg had been analyzing encryption methods during the assessment period. Their codes were sophisticated by human standards, but not unbreakable. With Lisa's network maps and his decryption skills, they had the tools to send a message that would reach every corner of the Dominion simultaneously. Captain waited until his intelligence told him the High Conclave had voted to quarantine humanity and suppress all evidence of the trials. Then he gave the order to transmit. The message was simple. It contained the complete, unedited recordings of all 5 challenge trials, along with the official assessment data showing how humanity had been initially classified. It included the High Conclave's decision to suppress this information and quarantine the human species despite their demonstrated capabilities. and it asked a single question that would echo across 3,000 star systems. If the ruling species could not accept evidence that contradicted their assumptions, what else might they be wrong about? The transmission reached every inhabited world in the Dominion within minutes. It appeared on public broadcast channels, private communication networks, and military command frequencies. They scrambled to block it, but they were too late. The truth was already spreading faster than they could contain it. The reaction across the Empire was immediate and explosive. Lower-tier species who had accepted their place in the hierarchy began asking questions. They had been told that their classification was based on objective measurement of their capabilities. They had been told that the founding species were naturally superior, and that this superiority justified their authority. Now they had watched a species from outside the Dominion prove that the entire system might be based on false assumptions. On hundreds of worlds, species that had never questioned their status began demanding their own challenge trials. If humans could succeed, perhaps they could too. Perhaps they had always had the potential that the Dominion's assessment process was designed to suppress. The carefully maintained order of the Empire began to crack, not through violence or rebellion, but through something more dangerous to established power: doubt. Citizens who had never questioned authority started questioning everything. High Overseer Methcallan realized that the situation required a different approach. He requested a private meeting with Captain, hoping to understand how a primitive species with one damaged ship had outmaneuvered an empire that had dominated the galaxy for 10,000 years. The meeting took place in a neutral conference room on the station. Methcallan arrived with a minimal escort, perhaps finally treating humans with something approaching respect. Came alone, projecting a confidence that seemed absurd given the power imbalance between one ship and an entire empire. Methcallan asked what humanity wanted. Was this a prelude to war? Were humans seeking to destroy the Dominion and establish their own empire? His answer surprised the High Overseer. He explained that humans had no interest in ruling the galaxy or overthrowing the Dominion. They had stumbled into this situation by accident, and their only goal had been to be treated with basic dignity and respect. When that was, they had defended themselves using the only weapons available: truth and capability. Said that humanity simply wanted to be left alone to explore the universe at their own pace. They would return to their home planet and share what they had learned. If the Dominion wanted peaceful relations with Earth, humans would welcome that. If the Dominion chose to see humanity as a threat, then humanity would respond accordingly. Methcallan pointed out that the Dominion still had overwhelming military superiority. Thousands of warships against one damaged vessel. Whatever disruption humans had caused, they could not actually threaten the Empire. Agreed that this was currently true. Then he asked a question that would haunt Methcallan for the rest of his very long life. He asked the High Overseer to consider what one ship with fewer than 200 humans had accomplished in just a few weeks. They had passed trials designed to confirm superiority. They had exposed the flaws in the Dominion's entire classification system. They had broadcast information that was currently destabilizing the Empire's social order. If one small crew could do all this by accident, continued, what did Methcallan imagine would happen when humanity arrived in force? Earth had 8 billion people, many of them as capable as his crew or more so. Humanity had been reaching for the stars for barely a century. What would they be capable of in 1,000 years? In 10,000? Suggested that the Dominion had two choices. They could try to destroy humanity before it became a true threat, which would require finding Earth and launching an invasion against a species that had just demonstrated remarkable capabilities. Or they could accept humans as equals and build a relationship based on mutual respect rather than hierarchy. The decision was ultimately not his to make, acknowledged, but he hoped the High Overseer would choose wisely. Humanity did not seek conflict, but they would not accept subjugation either. Methcallan sat in silence for a long time after finished speaking. The human captain waited patiently, giving the alien leader time to process everything that had changed. 6 months had passed since the USS Horizon accidentally jumped into space, and the galaxy had changed in ways that no one could have predicted. The crew of the human vessel had become witnesses to a transformation that would reshape interstellar civilization for generations to come. The Dominion still existed, but its rigid hierarchy had begun to evolve in fundamental ways. The challenge trial system that had once been used to confirm the natural inferiority of new species was now being used by established species to demand reclassification. Hundreds of worlds had submitted formal requests. Some species succeeded in their trials and earned higher-tier status. Others failed but gained something equally valuable: the knowledge that they had tried and that trying was possible. The philosophy underlying the entire Dominion was being questioned for the first time in 10,000 years. Scholars who had spent centuries studying the natural order of species were now writing papers asking whether that order had ever been natural at all. Perhaps it had always been artificial, a system designed to justify power rather than to measure capability. Captain watched these changes with mixed feelings. He had not set out to revolutionize an alien civilization. He had simply refused to accept being treated as inferior when he knew his crew was capable of more. The consequences had grown far beyond anything he had imagined during those first tense days of assessment and condescension. The crew of the USS Horizon had become reluctant celebrities throughout the Dominion. Species from dozens of worlds traveled to the station where the humans were docked, hopping to meet the beings who had looked upon an ancient empire and simply refused to be impressed. They wanted to understand how humans thought, what made them different, and whether their success in the trials contained lessons that could be applied elsewhere. And his officers did their best to explain that they were not exceptional by human standards. Earth was full of people who could have done what they did or better. Every member of their crew had strengths and weaknesses, moments of brilliance and moments of failure. They were simply representatives of their species, not its greatest examples. This answer seemed to fascinate the visitors even more than claims of superiority would have. A species where ordinary individuals could perform at the level the crew had demonstrated was a species worth understanding better. Chief Engineer Brooks finally completed repairs on the jump drive, with assistance from technicians who had abandoned their previous condescension. The alien engineers had been humbled by his performance in the technology trial, and they approached the repair work with genuine curiosity about human engineering principles. Shared his knowledge freely, explaining the theories behind human propulsion systems and receiving equally valuable insights into technology in return. When the repairs were complete, the USS Horizon was capable of making the journey home. The crew began preparing for departure with a combination of eagerness and reluctance. They had made friends among the station's diverse population. They had learned things about the universe that would take years to fully process. Leaving meant ending one chapter and beginning another that they could not predict. Dr. Maria Santos finished her final report on the various species they had encountered during their unexpected stay. Her conclusion was thoughtful and carefully worded. She noted that biological diversity across the Dominion was remarkable, and that cultural variation among spacefaring species was endlessly fascinating. But the fundamental assumption underlying the entire empire, that some beings were inherently superior to others, was not only wrong but had stunted galactic civilization for. Species that might have contributed great innovations had been relegated to labor roles. Minds that could have solved important problems had been dismissed as primitive and unworthy of education. Art and music and philosophy that might have enriched the galaxy had been ignored because it came from the wrong tier. The Dominion had built an empire on a foundation of wasted potential. Maria hoped that the changes beginning to spread through the empire would eventually lead to something better. A galaxy where species were judged by their actual contributions rather than their assigned categories. A civilization that embraced diversity as a strength rather than managing it as a hierarchy. On the day scheduled for departure, High Overseer Methcallan came to the docking ring personally. He had not spoken with Captain since their private meeting 6 months earlier, but he had clearly been thinking about their conversation. Methcallan told that the High Conclave had voted to send a diplomatic delegation to Earth within the year. They wished to establish formal relations with humanity, not as a subject species within the tier system, but as equals outside it. This was unprecedented in Dominion history. No species had ever been granted equal status without centuries of gradual advancement through the established hierarchy. Thanked him sincerely and extended his hand in the human gesture of respect and agreement. Methcallan studied the offered hand for a moment, then extended one of his own manipulator limbs to complete the gesture. It was awkward and slightly uncomfortable for both of them, but it meant something. The High Overseer said one more thing before boarded his ship. He admitted that when the humans first arrived, he had seen them as a minor nuisance to be processed and forgotten. He had been certain of his superiority and certain that the Dominion's way of ordering the galaxy was correct. The humans had forced him to question certainties he had held for longer than their entire species had existed. He was not sure whether to thank them or curse them for that, but he acknowledged that the galaxy would be different because of what they had done, and different was not always bad. Nodded and wished him well. Then he walked through the docking tube for the last time and joined his crew on the bridge of the USS Horizon. Navigation Officer Cole had already plotted their course home. The jump would take them through several intermediate points before reaching Earth, a journey of about 2 weeks if everything worked correctly. Lisa Tanner ran final checks on all systems and reported that they were ready for departure. Took his seat in the command chair and looked around at the faces of his crew. These people had accomplished something extraordinary together. They had represented humanity in the most important first contact in history, and they had done it with skill, courage, and dignity. He gave the order to disengage from the station and prepare for jump. The USS Horizon pulled away from the massive structure that had been their home for half a year. Through the viewports, they could see dozens of alien vessels changing position to watch them leave. Some of those ships had been sent to destroy them just months ago. Now they were forming an honor escort to see the humans safely to the jump point. As the ship accelerated toward open space, Lisa asked the captain what he thought would happen when they got home. What would humanity do when they learned about the galactic community waiting among the stars? Considered the question carefully before answering. He said that humans would react the way they always had to new discoveries. Some would be excited and eager to explore further. Others would be frightened and want to hide from the unknown. Politicians would argue about implications. Scientists would demand follow-up missions. The military would want better weapons. Artists would find new inspiration. Philosophers would write endless papers about meaning and purpose. In other words, humans would adapt and argue and create and push forward into the unknown, exactly as they had always done throughout their history. As for the galaxy, suspected it had no idea what was coming. They had spent 10,000 years building an empire based on the assumption that they represented the peak of intelligent life. They had never encountered a species that looked at their achievements and thought that they could do better. Now they had, and nothing would ever be the same. The USS Horizon vanished into the space between stars, carrying its crew back toward a world that did not yet know how much everything had changed. Behind them, an ancient empire continued its slow transformation. Ahead of them, a young species waited to learn that the universe was far larger and far stranger than they had ever imagined. And somewhere in the vast darkness between galaxies, other civilizations continued on their own paths, unaware that a small blue world called Earth had just announced its presence to the cosmos in the most unexpected way possible.